Evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special event that we're holding tonight to tell you about our exciting plans to bring back beavers to Nottinghamshire for the first time in 400 years. My name's Paul and I'm the Chief Exec of the Notts Wildlife Trust, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome more than 250 of you to this really special event tonight, and that number is still climbing, so it's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. As many of you will know, the Idle Valley Nature Reserve is a really special place for wildlife, full of magical experiences, extensive wetlands, grasslands, meadows. But we're facing here a global, national and local ecological crisis. And it's in that context that we really believe that the Idle Valley Nature Reserve can be even better for wildlife and an even more important place for people to escape the pressures of the modern world. We really believe it can be improved for wildlife, and we're going to tell you even more about that tonight with our expert colleagues who'll be at hand to give you some presentations later. We also think it can be really improved for people, to be a place to connect, to be part of nature, and where thousands of people, we hope, will come every year to have a special experience of wildlife, to connect with wildlife and feel inspired to take action when they get home, to save wildlife where they live and at work. And we also really want the Idle Valley to be a vibrant part of the local community and the local economy, where we're playing a really important part in bringing people to the area and supporting jobs and growth and that local tourism business. So in essence, we are really wanting the Idle Valley Nature Reserve to be an iconic wild place, important not only within our county, but across the Midlands and beyond. So for those of you who have joined us tonight on this strange Zoom world, I'm just going to run through a couple of quick technical points, and colleagues behind the scenes are on hand as well to help with this. You'll notice at the bottom of your screens there is a Q&A button. That's available to you all night to ask any technical questions that you might have, but also for you to raise questions, which we'll be then able to come to later in the evening when we get to our panel discussion. So please use that Q&A button for those particular purposes. So how is this event going to run? Well, I'm absolutely delighted tonight that I'll be joined by three of my expert colleagues, Elliott Kean, Michael Walker and Janice Bradley, who will be on hand to, first of all, Elliott will give us a presentation about why beavers are so important and why they're so special. I'll then hand over to Michael, who will tell you all about why we want to bring beavers back to the Idle Valley Nature Reserve and the important things that they'll be able to do when they're there. And then I'll be joined, or we'll be joined rather, by Janice, who will then form part of the panel to answer your questions. So we're hoping that we'll have lots of questions coming through, and the team behind the scenes are going to help manage those and bring them together so we can get through as many of them as we possibly can. So I think after that then, once we've had the panel, we'll then have a few closing remarks, and I promise you that we will be finishing at 8 o'clock promptly, so you can get on and carry on with the rest of your evening. So that's enough from me. I think I'll hand over now to Elliott, who will give you our first presentation and introduce why beavers are so amazing. Thanks, Elliott, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So I'll share my screen. As Paul says, I'm going to give you a background about the beavers in general and why they're so, the benefits of beavers, why they're so important. Okay. So first of all, we need to meet the species for those of you that aren't familiar with beavers. So when we're talking about beavers in Britain, we're talking about the Eurasian beaver or castor fiber. Beavers are the world's second largest rodent after the capybara of South America. So they're a big hefty animal. And they're semi-aquatic, so they spend some of the time on the land, some of the time in the water. And we'll look in a second at some of the adaptations they have for life in the water. They're completely herbivorous, no matter what C.S. Lewis said in the Narnia books. They don't eat fish, and we'll look a little bit more at their diet as well. And this is one of my favourite words, they're crepuscular. So they're not diurnal or nocturnal, they're crepuscular, meaning they're most active during dawn and dusk. Those are the best times to see them. And there are keystone species, which is a term used in ecology to mean a species that's very strongly interacting. It has a larger impact on its environment than its size or its abundance would suggest alone. They're very strongly interacting species that other species rely upon because they've co-evolved. And they're separate from the other species of beaver that we have on Earth, which is the American beaver, or Castor canadensis. Some of you might have heard it called the Canadian beaver, but it's the same species. So beavers were in Britain about 2 million years ago, and we know from fossil evidence, we know from historical records, and even place names. So in Nottinghamshire, Beavercote is an example of a beaver-derived place name. But they were hunted for their fur. Beaver hats were particularly popular, for their meat, and for a secretion from their scent glands called castoreum that was used in perfume, food, and medicine. To give you an idea of the really fast drive towards beaver extinction, in the 10th century, a beaver pelt was worth 120 pence, whereas a wolf pelt was worth just 8 pence. So if you were a hunter in the 10th century, you know what you would go for. Especially when one is a slow herbivore and the other is a fast carnivore with big teeth. Something else that contributed to beavers' extinction was actually that monks classed them as fish. Because of religious reasons, they could only eat fish at certain times of the year. And over time, they decided, well, otters are fish, and yeah, beavers, they're fish as well. And that contributed because it was quite a focused effort on those aquatic mammals. Not all the meat that was available on land in the form of deer and boar and those sorts of things. And because of all those things, they were hunted to extinction in the UK by sometime in the 1700s and even earlier in Nottinghamshire. And then we headed over to the Americas to get the beavers there. But lucky for us, beavers survived in mainland Europe. So by the 20th century, there are about 1,200 left in the whole of the world of Eurasian beavers in 8 isolated populations. But since then, they've recovered quite dramatically in Europe because of habitat restoration, but really just the lack of persecution, the decline of the hunting of beavers. And there have been over 200 reintroductions of beavers across Europe, so they're way ahead of us there. So when we're talking about reintroducing beavers, we're not necessarily talking about it for the sake of beavers, although we really do like beavers. It's for that keystone status. It's to help all the species that we already have still living in the UK that rely on those interactions. So more about the animal itself then. Let's look a bit at beaver anatomy. So at first glance, it looks a lot like any rodent really, but they do have lots of adaptations when you look closer. And I haven't put them all on here because I don't have that much time. One of its distinctive, probably its most distinctive feature is its dark grey, scaly, flat tail. And that's the beaver's multi-tool, really. It's used as a rudder when swimming. It's used as a seat, so they fold their tail underneath themselves to sit on. And I've got a photo in a few slides' time that shows that. They prop themselves up with it when they're reaching high up into a tree. It's used as an alarm. So slapped flat on the surface of the water, it's an alarm to warn the rest of the family group that there's danger, or to warn a beaver that's wandering into their territory, that's their territory. And it's also, we've discovered quite recently, used as a winter fat store. So during autumn and winter, their tail is about 50% fat. And during spring and summer, it's only 15% fat around. So it's used to store fat during really tough times. They've got a dense insulating layer of fur that can trap air, and then coarser guard hairs to protect that. And they're constantly grooming their fur using oils from their scent glands. And they've got a thick layer of fat to keep them warm. They've got small ears, but good hearing, poor eyesight, but an excellent sense of smell. Both their nostrils and their ears close when they submerge. And they've got built-in goggles as well. They've got a transparent membrane that covers the eyes called a nictitating membrane. The beaver's main weaponry, of course, is their teeth. They're strong, they're self-sharpening, and they continuously grow. They have enamel that's bright orange on the front, as you can see from that image. It's reinforced with iron. So as the fronts meet the backs, the teeth are constantly sharpening one another. They also have a flap of skin just behind the teeth so that they can carry things under the water without getting a mouthful of water. They've got very dexterous forepaws with 5 toes, so they can manipulate things quite effectively to feed and to build lodges and dams. Got very broad webbed back feet, and that's what they use to propel themselves through the water. And very unusually for a mammal, they have a cloaca, which is one hole in both males and females, used for waste disposal, scent secretion and reproduction. And we more associate those biologically with birds and with reptiles. So a really interesting animal. It's not all there. There's more to go at as well. So beaver diet then. It's seasonally varied. So they're obviously famous for felling trees, but they don't eat trees all the time. They're eating whatever they can get their paws on, really. So spring and summer, it's mostly this herbaceous vegetation. So in the top image, bramble. In the bottom, looks like arrowhead in a pond. And in the autumn and winter, when that's not available, they're getting the cambium beneath tree bark and the small shoots of woody plants as well. But they'll commonly feed on over 70 different plant species and a lot more besides those, including invasive species like Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed. But this is what they're more famous for. You can see the beaver there using its tail as a seat. And they can fell trees of over 1 meter in diameter. So that's huge. That's really impressive. But they don't do that very often. And when they do, they can't move that big trunk. That's going to stay there as fallen deadwood, which is a resource in itself. And they'll use some of the larger logs, possibly for construction of lodges and dams and things. But they're doing it mainly to access the smaller twigs at the top and then create a nice coppice stump, because they favour the smaller saplings. That's what's most useful for them to feed on, mostly below 5 centimetres in diameter. And they like aspen, poplar, willow and rowan. And most of the feeding happens, this is from data across Europe, it's all between 90 and 99% of the feeding is within 20 metres of the water that they inhabit. So that makes conflict mitigation of that type quite simple. Beaver habitats, they like freshwater habitats, still or slow moving water, and they want quite stable depths of at least 60 centimetres. And they want deciduous trees to build with and to feed on. They're quite territorial. We're very, very territorial, and their territory size varies with habitat quality. So if it's good quality, they don't need as much of it. And obviously the density of the population, so there's different levels of competition. But generally they'll have about 3 kilometres of shoreline. But they're very adaptable. If it's not suitable in the first instance, in lots of cases they can make it suitable. So in this image, they've obviously built a small dam to deepen that water. So why do they build dams? Well, it's to create deeper water so that they feel safe. They've got that perceived threat of predation, even though in the UK we don't have predators like lynx, wolves and bears anymore. But there are still some species that might have a go at the kit, the young. And they do it to conceal the lodge entrance or the burrow entrance, which is generally submerged for safety, and to access food sources from the water or near to the water. And they'll excavate canals as well to extend their reach. So they're generally around 70 centimetres high, but sometimes a lot smaller. And they're made of sticks, rocks, mud and vegetation. But they'll rarely dam lakes. They don't always build dams because they've already got that deeper water, and rivers wider than 10 metres, they won't do that. They won't dam those either. So it's mainly in the headwaters of streams, hence this huge benefit to us in terms of flood prevention and habitat creation in that marginal land of headwaters. This is a nice illustration from Arc Nature showing a few different things, showing the long dam that they've created, creating a larger area of wetland, benefiting fish, aquatic invertebrates, amphibians, wetland birds, creating lodges, possibly many in their territory, benefiting otters that can use them as halts, pine martens, inundating trees, creating standing deadwood that benefits bats and birds like woodpeckers and willow tits, benefiting downstream settlements as well through their flood prevention. So we call them ecosystem engineers, which is a particular type of keystone species that's really interesting. So the effect of all this tree felling, grazing, and dam building increases habitat heterogeneity, so the variety of different habitats in that landscape, and therefore the number of species that can live there. So they're enhancing biodiversity at a landscape scale by creating patches of different types of beaver inhabited areas and beaver uninhabited areas, or areas where they don't construct dams. And they're improving water quality because they're trapping sediment and pollution behind that dam. And they're creating fish spawning grounds or restoring them because it's trapping that silt and then exposing the river gravels again. And they're augmenting or helping to provide and boost ecosystem services, things that we benefit from as humans. So carbon sequestration, particularly flood mitigation. But their impact is so far-reaching, you'll imagine we could do hours just on beavers. But I've put a few points here. I've split it up into things that they add, things that they take away, and things that they regulate. So very quickly, they're adding to the wetland area. They're adding to the amount of submerged deadwood and organic matter. They're increasing the amount of deadwood on land as well, which is an important habitat in itself. They're reducing the cover of aquatic vegetation. So there's a mixture of dappled light and dark and covered and uncovered. And that benefits species that are threatened by the overgrowth of pond vegetation, like great crested newts. They reduce suspended sediment and pollution by trapping it. And they reduce the canopy density of riparian forest or wetland forest. So they're letting light to the forest floor for flowers and butterflies and things, similar to what we do on lots of our nature reserves. And they're regulating the water level and the flow rate. So that benefits a whole range of species that are threatened by either flooding or drought. And over longer periods of time, they bring in cycles of succession and disturbance that create resilient ecosystems and dynamic ecosystems. So before I go, I just want to show you an example. There are quite a few trials popping up around the UK now. One of my favourite in terms of the science is the Enclosed Beaver project in Devon, which started in 2011. The reason it's my favourite and I want to tell you about it is because it's so simple. Only 3 hectares of an enclosure, and you'll learn in a second just how big we're planning for our enclosure, but it's only 200 metres of stream. So I'll tell you about the effects and then imagine what would happen at a river catchment scale rather than just 200 metres. So in 2011, when they introduced the beavers, they had this 200 metres. They've got an inflow at the top and an outflow at the bottom. So it makes it really simple to measure the difference in flow rate and water quality and those sorts of things. And they've only got 1 pond. And then in just 5 years' time, in 2016, they had a series of stepped dams, 13 dams in total, and they really transformed the area. So that's what it looked like. But what happened scientifically? Well, they increased the surface area, volume of water, and the number of ponds, benefiting wetland animals. They decreased the flood peaks as well. So this is above the beaver dam. The water just rushed straight down unimpeded. And then below the beaver dam, you'd see it's attenuated that flow. So it's got rid of that dangerous flood peak. And then the red line goes just above the blue line. So it's releasing it slowly and safely. So not only is it reducing flooding, but it's maintaining the base flows as well. And you can see that more in this graph about sediment as well. It's releasing it nice and slowly and safely. And finally, about pollution. So below the beaver dam, anecdotally, you can see the difference in the quality of water there with the suspended sediment. But they had reduced phosphate, reduced nitrogen, all this agricultural runoff of fertilizers, reduced sediment. The only thing that increased was the organic carbon, but that's just because beaver habitats and functional wetlands generally are high carbon environments. So they'll release some, but they're storing a lot as well. And with that, thanks very much. So to conclude, right from a small scale to a large scale, beavers breathe life into our ecosystems. They're the original wetland engineers, creating habitats, storing water, and enhancing biodiversity. And our wildlife evolved alongside them, and we need them back. If you want to know more about beavers, next Sunday we're putting on a webinar that goes into a bit more detail, so you can book onto that on our website. And with that, I'll hand you back to Paul.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elliot. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm amazed at just these creatures and their adaptations. It's absolutely fantastic, isn't it? The wonders of the natural world. So next up, I'm going to bring in Michael to the room, who's going to tell us about the project and why we want to bring beavers back to the Idle Valley Nature Reserve. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I'll just share my screen with you. Hopefully that's visible to everybody. Right, so Elliot's told us all about the beaver, how it lives and what it does for the environment, and particularly those last few slides, the sort of benefits it can bring to an ecosystem. So what I want to talk to you about now is how are we going to unleash beavers back into Nottinghamshire? How are we going to bring them back to Nottinghamshire, which they would have once been here? There's not a lot of, well, there's no archaeological evidence. There's not much evidence for beavers existing anywhere in Britain, but we know that they were widespread. They've left their traces in culturally and historically through some of the records that Elliot was talking about, in the hunting and place names, particularly place names, and Elliot touched on that. We have one place name in Nottinghamshire, Beavercots, which literally means beaver cottages. So that's a strong link to a lodge, beaver lodge. So we're looking at the Idle Valley Nature Reserve, which is by far our biggest nature reserve. It's 375 hectares, and this photo on the this main aerial photo shows just the northern portion of the site, just a fairly small area, small portion of the site really. You can see on the right hand side the full extent of the reserve, and I've circled the area that we're looking at. This photo does actually show it some years ago, and you can see in this area here it's still being worked. This is a former mineral quarry, it's a former gravel quarry, as is a lot of the great wildlife habitat in Nottinghamshire. A lot of it is former gravel pits, which has developed over the last 30, 40 years into the fantastic habitat that we have today. This area here, I'm hoping you can see my mouse. You'll see later on other pictures, but this is the area where we're looking to release the beavers into a very large enclosure. So just some facts and figures, some numbers about the reserve. So the entire reserve, 376 hectares. I may have said 375 a moment ago, but it's 376. And I've done a bit of a breakdown as to what the habitat is, the key habitats. So we're looking at 39% is water, so 148 hectares of water. Nearly a third is what you could consider open grassland. That could be large open fields, it could be grassland within a scrubland, margins of woodland, side of the river, all adds up to a third of the site. The volumes of woodland scrub depend very much on your definition of what's woodland and what's scrub, but more mature woodlands about 11% of the site, and scrub 57 hectares, making up about 15%. So it's quite a diverse site. There are other habitats, but they are the key main habitats. We also look after a huge amount of shoreline, 57 kilometres of shoreline to be exact, and also 8 kilometres of bankside of the River Idle. And just to put that figures into context and to give you some idea, because I can't imagine 57 kilometres, how big a distance that is in terms of how much we manage. But if you were to get in your car at Attenborough Nature Centre car park and drive all the way up to the Idle Valley to the Rural Learning Centre, to the car park there, you'll have travelled 59 kilometres. And from Attenborough to the Idle can take you an hour 15 minutes. So that's how much water we're actually looking after at the Idle Valley. Scrub is often a term that is used a sort of derogatory term, but it's an absolutely wonderful habitat, particularly when scrub is diverse in age and structure. This is quite young scrub, and this is the sort of stuff that will be used by quite a few species of nesting bird, and as it gets older it becomes less attractive to a number of species and starts to become attractive to others. But it's important that we have that diversity. So if we've got a diversity of age structure, we can have a wider range of invertebrate species, bird species, all kinds of things. So diversity and mosaic habitat is the key to having a successful nature reserve and a really thriving ecosystem. And we've already heard that beavers can be drivers of an ecosystem. This is Cambridge Scrape, the area that we know as Cambridge Scrape, which is just to the north of a sort of a unmade road, quite a busy unmade road that travels through Lound Village and goes across the Idle and beyond. This roughly measures about 62 hectares. And when we originally planned and started to think about doing a beaver release, we were just going to use probably less than a quarter of the site. We were thinking of just using this area as being the area that looked the most beavery, for want of a better word. But we soon realised, particularly once we got Derek Gale and Rasheen Campbell-Palmer, that our two experts, and the two national experts really on this kind of project, we realised that if we could raise the funds, that doing a far larger enclosure would be both beneficial to the beavers and to the habitat. So the plan is to go for, it'll be somewhere around about 55 hectares. The fence line will be in from this red line in most places, not all. So it will be smaller than the 62 hectares that encloses. So it's probably going to be between 55 and 57 or something like that. We won't know until we've got the final fence line. But you can see we've got a range of habitats there. We've got open water, we've got shoreline with open grassland, we've got extensive scrub and more mature woodland. If you keep this area in mind, this top corner, and we're going to fly over it now. This is the area that we first thought looked the most beavery, because it already looks like beavers have been at work in there. But you can see that all of those birch trees and willows, they're all very similar age. The structure isn't there. This looks quite open, but when this was taken in the winter, this was only a couple of months ago. But if you were to go in there in the summer, it can be quite dark in places. So there's not a lot of light getting to the ground and into the ponds as the drone disappears into the mist of the foggy day. But it was that day. But that just gives you an idea of what the habitat looks like. So I've circled the area on the map so you can see where you are on the reserve, and just a couple of views of the general habitat. So this is looking out at the open water and the sort of mixed grassland and scrub that's on site, that's mainly managed by our cattle. And there's another view, and you can see the regenerating scrub on the shoreline. We want to try and control that a little bit better to give better viewing into the so you can see the wildlife, particularly the breeding and migrant birds, which the site is so important for and is a SSSI for. I mean, you could be in Scotland and looking at some of the beaver areas when you see a site like that. It looks like a flooded pool that the beavers have dammed, but this is just normal water level in the parts of the Idle during the winter when the waters get a little bit higher. this is when it starts looking very beavery. In fact, you could be mistaken for thinking that there are already lodges here. They almost look like beaver lodges. And Derek Gow, when he visited, says that they probably won't even bother to build lodges. They'll drop the logs, but they may even burrow into the sides of these banks. They will burrow into banks to hollow out and make lodges that way. So we're not going to see all the benefits. We're not going to see. We've not got flowing water running through the site. So the site water level isn't going to be any more affected than it is now by seasonality. But what we will see is extensive changes to the structure of the scrub, particularly, and the trees. So there'll be different age classes. So we'll have some mature, we'll have some younger, we'll have some freshly coppiced. They aren't nature's original coppices. So very much what we do in our ancient woodlands to keep that structural diversity, particularly our woodlands near here where we've got dormice. We need to coppice to keep the habitat suitable for species like dormice. And beavers will do that 365 days of the year practically. So we will have this real range of structure across the whole enclosure, which will benefit so many other species. So there's Derek on the day when he came to survey and looked at the site and told us, why don't you look at the whole site, because this looks like beaver heaven. They'll do so well here. So that's what we're going to do. We've had to do extensive surveys to see where the best place for the fence line is, what the issues might be. This is a very early map that we used. But we've also started to do, last year, we started to do a lot of baseline surveys because we want this to be a site of study. We want to be able to study the impacts that the beavers have made in very much the same way as Elliott's described the Devon beaver trial. So we can try and find out what those ecological benefits are. So during last year, we had aquatic invertebrates, botanical surveys. We're just about to embark on a breeding bird survey, systematic breeding bird survey. A master student will be working on a amphibian survey, and we don't know whether we've got any reptiles, but we're going to look for them just to check whether we have or we haven't. But we certainly got plenty of amphibians, so we can see what a baseline would be for amphibians for this year before the beavers have gone in. So next year we'll be able to start measuring. We've had to do quite a bit of work along the fence line before the bird breeding season commenced, so we can then get the fence in place, ready for probably at the earliest, probably autumn. We're still waiting on the license to know exactly when, but we'll get them in as soon as we can. But we need the fence ready before we can release, obviously. So lots of survey and preparation work, and those surveys will ongo. And we've got a close partnership with Nottinghamshire University, especially with their species reintroduction specialisms, and various students will be coming on board with master's projects and PhD projects. So we're going to have a lot of study and a lot of information to share about how beavers have affected this landscape going forward. Mentioned the fencing, it's quite substantial. Special fencing designed to reduce the chance of, or greatly reduce the chance of beavers getting out. It will have areas to stop them digging underneath. So it's specially designed and will be varying degrees of security depending where it is and how close to water it is. But it will be a very secure beaver fence. So coming very soon to the Idle Valley Nature Reserve, where are they coming from? Most likely, well, almost certainly they'll come from Scotland. They'll come from the River Tay catchment, where an unofficial release of beavers took place in the dim and distant past, where they have done incredibly well in terms of numbers. But in areas they are having to be removed from site where they are causing some localized flooding and impacts of farmland. So there has been licenses issued by the Scottish authorities to actually shoot beavers in some cases, but we don't want that. We will have some of those beavers, and most of the reintroductions that you will be hearing about over the last year or two and going forward, virtually all of those beavers are likely to come from the Tay population as an alternative to culling. They're not going to be the only ecosystem engineer in the enclosure. They will also be assisted, as they have been for a while, as we've been using for a while, by our cattle. But we are gradually going to be moving on to a sort of a wilder cattle. You will be seeing more longhorn cattle on the reserve. And only today I was sent a video of one of these particular longhorns basically pulling down a small tree to get to the juicy buds at the top. So they are ecosystem engineers in their own right as well. So thank you, and we look forward to answering your questions now.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. The questions have been pouring in, so can I now welcome Janice into the room as well, who's going to form part of our panel this evening. So we've had, as I say, quite a few numbers of questions coming in. I think the first one, just to kick us off, is about it's to Elliott, and it's around whether beavers have any natural predators.
Yeah, so naturally it would have been mainly wolves. Lynx and bears would have worried them a little bit, but as far as the UK at the moment, it would only really be the kits that would be at risk from foxes, and there's some anecdotal evidence about whether otters might take kits, but no, not really. So in the long run, when we've got super high populations, then we might have to act as predators, but that's in the far, far future.
Great, thank you. Connected to that, I think this is one for Janice, is about whether beavers are a protected species.
Yes, that's a very good question. They are a protected species, so we have to apply for licenses, both to be able to have the beavers trapped for us in Scotland and also for them to be brought down and for us to release them here in England. So we have 2 license applications in play with Natural England at the moment. So yes, they have a high level of protection, and that's why, as Michael mentioned, people have to apply for licenses to shoot them in Scotland. Great,
thank you. We've got a question here, well, 2 actually quite connected questions, one from Neil and one from Kat, and it relates to and I think this one's to Michael, is are we talking about reintroducing to the Idle Valley, or the creation of a massive zoo was Neil's point, and Kat's point in connection to that is, do we conceive of a time when beavers might spread beyond nature reserve?
Well, we're not planning a massive zoo, although it will be an enclosure. We're not releasing beavers into the River Idle. There are no projects to release beavers in England outside of enclosures at the moment. The Natural England have suspended any of those for the time being, while the Devon beaver trial, not the other Devon beaver trial, not the Devon one that Elliott talks about, but the free living beavers that live in Devon. So until the final decisions have been made about that, there are no more free roaming projects ongoing. And so it's going to be a huge enclosure. They will be living totally naturally. The area is enough to support many families of beaver. We're likely to have potentially 2 families to start with. They may not be families, they may be 2 pairs. It just depends where they're trapped and how they're trapped. And if they have kits when they're trapped, the kits come with them, obviously. If they haven't got kits, then they don't. And we wait for them to breed themselves. So no, they won't be into the Idle Valley. It is an enclosure, but a very naturalistic enclosure. They are there to create the habitat of the enclosure. We aren't creating anything for them. They get what they're given, and they've got to make the best of what's there. So that doesn't sound like a zoo to me, but they are enclosed, but they're going to live a totally natural life and create the habitat that they want to create.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you, Michael. We've got a question here, and it connects into Elliott's presentation, so I'll direct it in your, and particularly the point around Devon and the free flowing water. We've got a question from Michael about, will the lack of free flowing water at the Idle Nature Reserve be detrimental for the beavers? Do they need to have that flowing water?
No, not necessarily. They can live in still water in areas of Scotland. They live in lochs. And as I mentioned, if they've got, often we're talking about small streams and then they're damming them, because that's where they have the most obvious impact, because they're creating deeper water. So we talk about that quite a lot, but in lots of beaver inhabited areas, they've already got that deeper water, and we don't talk about it because the impact's much less and you might not even know they're there. So we've already got areas that are plenty deep enough of water within the enclosure. So yeah, I think the phrase beaver paradise was used by experts like Derek Gow when they came to see. So
brilliant, thanks, Elliott. I think it's a question for Janice. It's a one from Valerie and Michael that are quite connected, which are around how we're going to manage visitors and potential disturbance of the beavers once hopefully we've been able to get them back to the nature reserve.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. As it's a very big enclosure, and obviously the beavers have a big area to make their home and to choose the optimum places where they want to have their lodges and where they want to settle themselves. But we do want visitors obviously to be able to see those beavers, but not to be able to disturb them directly. So the big fence round the enclosure will prevent people wandering into the enclosure by mistake, and will certainly stop dogs getting into the enclosure too, because as you can appreciate, that would be potentially quite damaging. But as part of the preparation for the beavers, we've cleared a fantastic swathe of what will become grassland for the fence line, and that will be where we'll be able to take visitors, our members, on guided walks and talks to go and look at the beavers in the evening at dusk, which, if any of you have seen the beavers in Scotland, is something that's really popular. So we'll definitely be able to take people on guided walks to do that kind of thing. But then also we're going to be establishing quite a comprehensive network of cameras. So we'll be able to beam back information about the beavers' activities back to the cafe at the Idle Valley Rural. Because obviously beavers are most active in the evenings, really, less so in the day in terms of what people could see. So we want to get lots of interesting footage that people can see in the cafe at any time of day via those cameras. And that will also help to ensure that not too many people go looking for the beavers, perhaps when they shouldn't.
Thanks, Janice. This question for Michael. So a couple of connected questions, one from Brian, and I've lost the name, sorry, apologies. But it's really around the monitoring side of it. So Brian's question was about whether we're going to be recording kind of video or whatever footage of this. And also the second question was about whether there'll be opportunities for volunteers and citizen science connected to the project.
Well, Janice has just mentioned we're going to have cameras, or recording the beaver behaviour. Initially, when the beavers are first put in, it will be pretty much all cameras, because when you put the beavers in, you pretty much leave them alone. You don't want to disturb them. So even staff trying to monitor them, we'll keep away. We'll just let the beavers settle in while they're while they're finding their feet in their new home. In terms of ongoing monitoring, and was it about volunteers? How people
citizen science and volunteers.
Citizen science. Well, I've mentioned that the university will be a big part of that, but we will be looking at ways volunteers can get involved in helping in all aspects of the Beaver project. So that might be people inspecting the fencing, helping on the regular fence inspections that have to happen. It could be some of the walkthrough surveys we're going to have to do when we want to check where the beavers have been active. And they're very easy to see field signs of the beaver, because you just look for a tree, and if there isn't one where there used to be, probably a beaver's been along. So we'll be wanting to record where all their activity's been. So that will require help. And I'm sure there'll be opportunities for volunteers to assist staff doing that. I don't think it's fully been worked through yet in terms of how, but we are certain that volunteers are going to play a big part. Volunteers underpin all of our work, and we can't do we couldn't do much of what we do without volunteers. So there will be plenty of opportunities for volunteers, and we'll try and get some citizen science projects there with local schools as well. It's an educational, real educational opportunity, which we want to use.
Thank you, Michael. Got a couple of questions around the gene pool. So we'll see one here from Hayley. So probably to Elliot, as we've kind of so it's about the gene pool. If we're bringing them from Scotland, is it quite limited? Is that likely to be problematic?
Yeah, I'm not sure this one's a question for me, so I'll let Janice go after. Yeah, it's yeah, you go ahead, Janice. Yeah.
Okay. Again, another great question. Yes, we're taking the issue of the gene pool really seriously. It's a very important question. So all our beavers that come from the Tay will they all have veterinary inspections done at the Five Sisters Zoo in Edinburgh, which is the kind of big beaver handling centre there for projects up in Scotland, and they'll have blood tests taken, and a very sophisticated genetic analysis will be done for all our beavers, and then they'll also be microchipped so that we can also manage and monitor them in the future. And that information will go on to what's going to be a national beaver genetic database, so that looking forward in the future, we'll know exactly what the relatedness is between those beavers that we've introduced to the Idle Valley Nature Reserve, and we'll also know exactly what their relatedness is to any of the other projects. So for example, Derbyshire Wildlife Trust project or the Yorkshire ones. So in the future, when we're looking at what happens with beaver populations when they do start to eventually outgrow their enclosures, which for us is quite a long time because we have a very big enclosure, it'll be sooner for some other organisations. We'll know very carefully and exactly which beavers can and can't be moved around and who they might be able to be introduced to in other places in the future. And Nottingham Trent University has done some brilliant modelling for us on beaver numbers and genetic relatedness to help prepare us for that.
Brilliant, thanks, Janice. Got a couple of questions around how the support for the project, either from the local landowning community, the surrounding farmers, landowners, but also whether we've got support from other partners, for example, the local authorities and such like. I'm maybe looking to Michael maybe to kick this one off.
I think probably Janice on that one, because she's been more involved in the. Sorry, Janice.
Right, that's fine. Yes, so the decision to reintroduce beavers is based on the development of a framework for recovering species, lost species in our county, and that's a multi-partner project. So all our key partners and stakeholders you'd expect, the statutory agencies, other NGOs, other key stakeholders have all agreed that this is the right thing to do. So we have really wide backing for that amongst the sort of technical ecological community. And then in terms of our neighbours locally, who obviously it's really important that they're on board. So from the very earliest stage, we were in contact with all our neighbouring farming landowners at the Idle Valley Nature Reserve, and all are now positive to various degrees about the project, or at least not negative. We've had some concerns raised about farmers who are further upstream near Retford about whether beavers might cause flooding in the River Idle, but that was because they thought that they would be in the River Idle rather than in the nature reserve. So just through, talking with those key stakeholders like farmers and landowners, the Internal Drainage Board, we're getting the message out there that this isn't about damming the river and flooding Retford. That's been the biggest cause of concern so far, has been that misinformation that we'd be in the river.
Great, thanks, Janice. We've got some questions here about, well, firstly from Peter about kind of fish. Are there any fish in the enclosure? And if so, would they be included in the surveys? We can talk about the kind of monitoring and assessment. So I guess I don't know whether Michael, you wanted to pick that up.
Well, there will be fish within there. We've not got any projects that are going to monitor fish numbers at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we won't have. Fish generally increase in number where there are beavers, much to the reverse of what a lot of people might think, because as Elliot says, they don't eat fish. They just create a habitat where fish will thrive. Obviously more in a flowing water body where they create the deep pools, but we are still going to get them create channels, and they will create some small scale, I'll call them dams for want of a better word, but they will create ponds. So that area where I showed you, where we flew over on the drone, there are lots of finger ponds, and they might decide that they actually want the ponds to look a little bit different. They want to make that one, smaller, or make one bigger. They'll knock a couple through. They will structure it exactly how they want it, and they'll put channels between them. And anything that creates that and opens up areas is going to be beneficial for fish as well. If they're going to make water deeper in places, they will do that. So it's fish will benefit. We haven't quite got a project in place for fish yet. I'm sure we'll come up with one.
Well, actually, Michael, while you've got the floor, there's a question from Richard, which is quite connected to what changes we're going to see, but it's particularly a question around timescales. So when might we expect things to start to look differently? That's from Richard.
Well, I think we'll see signs that beavers have been there fairly quickly within the enclosure. You might not see that from the outside, as it were. I mean, once we've decided where the release locations are going to be, we've got an idea where they're going to be, but that'll be assessed nearer to the time by Derek and Rasheen, really. They know best on that, so we're just going to leave that to them. It'll take a while for the beavers to explore their area. I think has happened in some areas, the beavers, we can put all the experience that Derek and Rasheen have into selecting the area where the beavers are going, and they'll have other ideas. They'll think, okay, we don't think we'll have a good look and we'll move somewhere else that everybody says was terrible, but we actually love. So we'll wait and see what happens there. But they need to eat, and they eat the stuff just below tree bark. So they're going to start feeding very soon, and we're going to start seeing trees on the ground and coppice stumps forming all over the place, and that will be really the first thing that we're going to see. And as that coppice grows back, within 3 or 4 years, it'll be of that height where different species of bird will start using it. It's going to be a slow process, but it's going to be a process where we're going to see an impact quite quickly. They're going to make their presence felt fairly soon on.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next ones are for Janice. We've got quite a few questions around timeframes, timescales. So if you could just give a bit of a sense of when we're hoping that this is going to happen, obviously with funding notwithstanding. Okay.
Absolutely. So our two license applications have been with Natural England now for about 3 or 4 weeks. We've been given estimated decision dates for one towards the end of April and for the other in the middle of May. Those are the dates from the Natural England National Licensing Team. That may be a bit delayed. They may well come back to us because obviously with COVID, they're working in difficult conditions like everyone else. But they obviously will come back to us and to Derek Gow if they have any sort of technical questions that they want to ask. So all being well, I'd like to say that perhaps conservatively within another 2 to 3 months, we should hopefully have our licenses in place, and then things could really happen very quickly. So we've done a huge amount of preparation work, as I say, already clearing the route for the fence line, so that scrub clearance could be done before the breeding bird season started. And the fence will be constructed within the next sort of month to 6 weeks. So we'll be ready and waiting really for when our licenses are available. And then it'll just be a question of how quickly those beavers either come from new trappings after the end of the trapping close season in Scotland, or they may actually come from ones that have already been trapped from the Tay. There's been a very busy programme of trapping up there at the moment that's just stopped for the breeding season, and they're being held in a number of enclosures in different areas, sort of waiting to be released into the English enclosures. I think that apparently the zoo in Edinburgh is completely full of beavers at the moment, or waiting to come to their lovely new English homes.
Brilliant, thank you, Janice. Got a question here, I think possibly for Michael, from Ellis, aged 8. Says, what if the beavers bite through the fence, or is it an electric fence?
Well, the beavers aren't likely to. It's metal, the fence, and the posts. You would think that the last thing you would make a fence post out of to keep beavers in would be wood, but wooden fences, they eat the bark, so there's no problem there. And the fencing posts are on the outside of the metal mesh, so the mesh is on the inside, so the beavers can't get to that. So no, they won't eat the fence or bite through the fence. Great question, though, and good to be concerned about it. But we've thought about that one as well.
We've got time for a few more questions, so we'll keep going. We've got a question from Rosie, which I think possibly to Elliot is your beautiful illustration that might have prompted it. Are there any particular species, birds, insects, etc., that you think might benefit from bringing the beavers back to Notts?
Yeah, it's tricky to say after 400 years, but from all the studies that have gone on, they benefit across multiple taxa and some species that we really struggle to manage by conventional means. So a lot of it might be quite unexpected when we put things in the hands of animals rather than habitat managers. It can be unexpected. So I think that's the question that we're looking to answer, really.
Right. There was a question possibly for Janice, actually, which is around impact on other species. I suppose it's the flip side of the previous question from Rosie about whether putting the fence around is going to stop other wildlife, otters or deer or hedgehogs, etc. What are the implications for other wildlife?
Yeah, good question, and we have thought really carefully about this. So there are a lot of deer on the reserve. For those of you who don't know it, we have a really healthy population of roe deer, and they quite simply will be able to jump the fence if they want to carry on going into that area. It's easy for them to jump, so that they won't be affected. It's also not part of the reserve that they particularly use as much as other areas that they favour. We do know that there are badgers that use that area, and they'll need to continue to be able to get in and out through that fence. So the fence design actually includes some very clever gates that have been designed and used successfully elsewhere that will allow badgers to continue to go in and out on their normal favourite routes, but without letting the beavers in and out. And in terms of other small mammals, they'll be able to move quite freely because the mesh that we'll be using on the beaver fence, it's about a sort of 8 to 10 centimetre mesh, so it's about this kind of size. So very good for keeping beavers in, but equally perfectly fine for small mammals to still be able to get through. So, you know, hedgehogs, voles, things like that will be able to move very happily through that mesh.
Fantastic. I've just had a minute's warning, so I think we might have to draw the debate and the panel session to a close. But thanks so much to you all for submitting such brilliant questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through them all, but we tried to group them and take as many as we possibly could. So I think thank you once again for coming and joining us tonight. Hopefully you're going away inspired, informed, excited by what we're planning to do at the Idle Valley Nature Reserve by bringing back this incredible lost species from our landscape. We have launched the fundraising appeal. We launched it a few weeks ago, back in mid-February, and we've set ourselves a target of £250,000 to raise by the end of this month. And I'm absolutely delighted to say we're about 3/4 of the way there so far. So all contributions now are helping us to get us towards that final target. So hopefully you'll please consider supporting making this vision a reality. So final thanks to Michael, to Elliot and to Janice for their brilliant expert contributions. A thank you to the team behind the scenes for all of their support. We've had around 300 people on this session tonight, so it's absolutely incredible. The level of interest is brilliant. So final thank you from me to say we very much welcome your support. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of your evening. Take care. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.